Thank you so much, Brent. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so thanks for the lovely introduction and thanks for inviting me here. I want to add a little bit to my introduction. So, Uvana Atika, a Sikolok. My Inupiat name is Kilyak. It was given to me by a Sikolok and Amy Topcock in Fairbanks. And the reason I'm adding that name, it will be obvious when I tell you what it means. And it means mammoth. They thought very hard about the name to give me in my Inupiat name, and so I'm really proud of that name. So, so I'm going to be talking about hunting mammoths, and really, I know I'm speaking to an archaeological kind of dominated crowd here, but actually what we're going to be talking about is more researchers hunting mammoths than people hunting mammoths. And so, but I always like to start off talks with gratitude. We started with a land acknowledgement, which I was really pleased to see and hear. And so I always like to start with gratitude. Gratitude to you for coming out on this cold evening. Gratitude for being here. I like to start with gratitude to the Dene people of the Lower Tanana River, on whose land my lab is based that does all of this work, and the university is based. It's where I live, it's where my wife lives, and it's where my two kids were born on that land too. So I like to give that vote of gratitude there. I also like to give gratitude to, it's not me on my own. I mean, I work with a ton of people, and I put Al at the end here because there are numerous other people as well. And of course, I also want to thank the University of Alaska Museum of the North. A lot of the data that you're going to see is generated on specimens from that museum collection, and I want to put a thanks out there as well. And so I also want to thank funding for the work that I do. Primarily comes from the National Science Foundation, the United States National Science Foundation, and also from Colossal, who's a bioscience company that I serve on the scientific advisory board for, that are working on de-extincting the mammoth alongside a number of other organisms, and we can talk about that a little more if you'd like. So why mammoths? Why are mammoths important to us, our understanding of the Arctic and climate change? So I live in Fairbanks. I live in a region of what's called discontinuous permafrost. And so north of where I live, the ground is permanently frozen all of the year. And south of where I live, there's not permafrost. But in Fairbanks, we're kind of at that limit. And it's not uncommon to see parts of the ground right now kind of caving in as permafrost is actually thawing. It's very alarming. I live with it. I see it on a daily basis. I pass a house that is kind of falling into thawing permafrost. So I am very aware and see climate change. That climate change as well is also releasing methane as organic matter that has been locked up for 20,000 years, is then being exposed to microbes, that then is entering the atmosphere, that then is also a very potent greenhouse gas. You can see that this is a potential for a positive feedback loop. So, but why mammoths? Why are mammoths important to our understanding of climate change in the Arctic? Well, it turns out that there are a number of megafauna that are suffering, I would say, at the hands of climate change right now. Their movement patterns are being impacted. Their access to food resources are being impacted as well. But this is not all about doom and gloom. On the other hand, there are certain megafauna, I'm going to put beavers in there with megafauna as well, that are taking advantage of the situation as well. The Arctic is greening. We are seeing the advance of woody shrubs and trees moving gradually north, and beavers are taking advantage of that and changing their biogeography. Moose, the same as well. We're starting to see moose further and further north as well. So it's not all doom and gloom. Some folks are taking advantage of this situation. But when you are funded by the National Science Foundation, really any single project is 3 years, 4 years, 5 at most. And our potential as ecologists to really understand how megafauna respond to climate change is very limited. That's a fairly short window of ecological time to be able to understand how these animals might respond. However, as a paleoecologist, I study ecosystems and ecological experiments that have been conducted over tens of thousands of years, sometimes even millions of years. And so we have great potential to ask questions about how megafauna performed and even went extinct as the result of climate change. And I'm just going to show you, this is the Greenland ice core record of temperature. And what you see here is a roller coaster of temperature change that occurred after the end of the last ice age. And it's very interesting that many megafauna actually went extinct during that period of time. It's very complicated in Alaska because this same period of time is when people, some of the first people into the Americas, were starting to show up in Alaska as well. So this is a very wonderful forensic story that when I first came to Alaska, I didn't even know what Beringia was, and I was like, what is that? But this is a fantastic forensic story, a tremendous kind of whodunit kind of story. Climate change, people, fires, even meteorites or mega diseases have been proposed as well. There's also an additional reason for studying mammoths, and this is more immediate kind of need as well, is because a number of companies are actually working to de-extinct some creatures that have been extinct for a number of years, including the dodo, the thylacine, and of course the mammoth as well. So I see this as my important role here as a paleoecologist that studies mammoths, is because if we are going to de-extinct mammoths, it's probably a really good idea that we really understand them. We really understand how they moved, what they ate, what type of landscapes they like to spend their time in, and how even they kind of interacted with people that were on the same landscape as well. And so this is really what I do as a paleoecologist, is trying to understand those interactions between environment, climate, and organisms as well. And I guess the clock is ticking here, because I think Colossal estimates almost by maybe even 2028 that the first mammoth might be de-extincted. So get to it. But the thing about mammoths is, we all know what mammoths are. They're an icon of Alaska. They're an icon of the Ice Age. We've all seen Ice Age, the Meltdown cartoon movies. Perhaps we've seen Walking with Beasts, the BBC's Walking with Beasts. We know what a mammoth is, but it's actually really surprising how little detail, scientific knowledge we have about how mammoths behaved and how they existed. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a mammoth hunt here. We're going to go on tell a few stories here. And I'm going to tell you about three stories, three questions. What killed the last known population of mammoths in Alaska? This is a good story. What habitats supported mammoths? And how did mammoths move around on the landscape? These are our questions that we're just going to be moving forward with. So let's start with what killed the last known population of mammoths in Alaska. So our story is going to take us to a very remote island in Alaska. It's called St. Paul Island. I describe it as one of my favorite places on the planet. It is exceedingly remote. You're on a plane flying out over ocean, and then whoosh, you're swooped down onto a small landing strip, and there you are on this treeless landscape. A very wonderful community lives on that. Aleut community lives on that island as well. That I enjoy seeing when I've been out there as well, and have helped us with our research. And so the thing about so what we have here is you have Alaska on the right-hand side here, and Canada right joined on, part of Canada joined on there as well. And then over on the left-hand side, you have Russia. And so, and I put a little circle there to give you the rough, if you were heading out there, that's where you'd be heading, out into that little red circle out there. And there's a little island there. Actually, there's a pair of islands. There's St. George Island and St. Paul Island. And so, but the landscape 20,000 years ago was very, very different. St. Paul Island was not even an island. It was part of what is the Bering Land Bridge that joined Asia to North America. And of course, you've got a massive great ice sheet there that was kind of blocking the way for organisms and even people back at this time as well. And so let's take that map and let's just zoom in a little bit on that piece of the Bering Land Bridge. And so St. Paul Island was actually kind of a hill or high point on the Bering Land Bridge, and the brown is the kind of like the modern extent of it. And so we'll assume for a moment that mammoths were moving around on this landscape and were moving past here. We'll come to this in a moment. Is why I seem to think that there was probably mammoths breezing past this location. But as the end of the Ice Age came about, sea levels also started to rise. And you see the blue starting to peak in there. Well, by 9,000 years ago, St. Paul Island was a mega island, but was completely cut off from Alaska and from the rest of the submerging Bering Land Bridge as well, submerged by this point here. And you see that little pocket of mammoths that's scooped up there on this mega island, which then gets completely isolated down to its like small extent right now. And that was the case from 8,000 years ago to about 5,600 years ago. And how do we know that? How do we know that mammoths were even present on St. Paul Island? Well, it's actually pretty easy. There was a mammoth tooth that was found on the island. In fact, it was found in a cave. And if you go to the Adopt a Mammoth website, there's a goofy video of me lowering myself down into that cave that has trapped like even modern foxes and reindeer in it as well. But about 5,600 years ago, a poor mammoth fell into that lava tube and didn't get out, and its remains were found there. And when you radiocarbon dated this, when they radiocarbon dated this mammoth specimen, they got a real surprise. 5,600 years old. To me, as somebody that studies the past, that's like yesterday. That's like yesterday. I mean, think about how civilization was on the rest of the planet. There was a little herd of mammoths that were located on St. Paul Island in the middle of the Bering Sea at that time. It's kind of incredible when you think about it. So back in 2014, we set off to St. Paul to study at this location, Lake Hill on St. Paul Island. It's a submerged volcano. It's extinct now, and it's filled in with mud, and it's filled in with water. And that mud has been building up layers in that lake for a really long time, since the last ice age, at least. And so we went out there in the spring when the lake was still frozen, which was great because we could scutter all of our coring equipment out, and our goal here was to take a core going down to the base of that volcanic crater and get that record of the past environments on St. Paul Island. And here we are, set in the middle of that, in the middle of the crater. It's kind of crazy science sometimes, isn't it? It's like, what are you doing? So here we are, and this is Choi, and that's our little mammoth mascot there at his foot. He's looking a little grumpy because we just had a mud fight with leftover mud, and Choi kind of lost. But here we are taking this core. It was meters and meters and meters long, and here's just a little piece of it, and you can see it's like a book. It's like the pages of time just written down there, ready to kind of reveal the past environments. And we had a number of questions. we wanted to know, okay, there's a mammoth tooth there that's 5,600 years old, but when did mammoths go extinct? Did they exist later than 5,600 years ago, or is that the date? So that was one of our questions, and we also want to understand how did the mammoths go extinct? So we dated the core using radiocarbon dating and tephra chronology as well, and then in the base of the core we saw these things, spore myella. These are the spores that grow, and I'm no expert on this, but they are the spores that grow on the poop of mega herbivores, big herbivores. Who figures, right? So, but here they are, and the base of the core was chock-a-block with these spore myella. Okay, so you had some mega herbivore that was dumping a lot of these spores and poop into this lake. Well, that's not really kind of great evidence, but also there was mammoth DNA, ancient DNA, in the base of this core as well, and so we could sequence that and figure out that there was. But there was a cutoff point, and so the cutoff point was at about 5,600 years ago, and then above that, no spore myella and no mammoth DNA. Isn't it great when science works out like that, right? It doesn't always work out like that, but this was fantastic. We had, and we could date those layers that you saw in that core, either side of that point where the DNA disappears. We had probably one of the most precisely dated extinction events in the geological record. I mean, it was fantastic. Sorry about that. So there we go, mammoths extinct at that point in time. And so we could also analyze those same core sediments for all kinds of other creatures as well that existed, not megafauna, but minor fauna, like cladocerans that lived in the lake, chironomids as well, these invertebrates. We could look at pollen and reconstruct the vegetation. We could look at isotopes, which is my expertise, and we could look at diatoms as well. And we could stack all those things together in what my wife calls these wiggly line figures. She's a biologist as well. She can't stand the wiggly line figures, paleo stuff. It's wiggly lines. I love wiggly lines over time. It's what I do. And so what we found was that at that time when those mammoths went extinct, that lake level dropped considerably. And it dropped so as to focus and concentrate salts in that lake. There were certain cladocerans and diatoms that were showing up that liked slightly, almost brackish type of water. Now, one of the things about mammoths that we already know about mammoths is they demand a lot of water. And there are not very many freshwater lakes or sites where fresh water could be got. You're surrounded by water, but it's marine water. And so the paper that we published put forward that, in fact, what happened was they ran out of drinking water. And that lake level had dropped because of climate change. So they were in a very tenuous position. They lived there isolated 8,000 years to 5,600 years ago, reproducing as a herd of mammoths. Climate changed just slightly, dried that lake up, freshwater access gone. They're done. That's it. And so one of the things I should have mentioned about St. Paul that we know so far is there is no archaeology beyond the Russians' introduction of the Aleuts recently onto St. Paul. So there's no old archaeology. So for right now, humans are not part of this extinction event, as far as we know. So, but the record gets more interesting as well because we can go back even further. In fact, we can ask the question, when did mammoths actually turn up? And in fact, the core goes back 18,000 years ago, but mammoth DNA only shows up at about 12,000 years ago. So that I find fascinating. What's fascinating is that they turn up during a period of time when temperature actually spiked and then dropped. And so they actually turned up after a change in climate. Stayed there for a long time, drinking water from that lake, and then climate changed, dried up the lake, and they're done. So that's the story from St. Paul Island. And often when you see these maps of Beringia, they kind of look like this, like these massive deserts of continuous color. But actually, Jeff Bond in 2019 published this wonderful map that actually put some different colors on the map. It put river channels, it put lakes. It suggested that in fact there were fairly large lakes that existed on this landscape as well. And I think this is absolutely fantastic. And actually, this takes us to our next little story and adventure. So the question here is, what habitats actually supported mammoths moving from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge to Alaska? Now there's a problem here. Have you figured it out? The problem is that it's underwater right now. So we can't kind of troop around trying to find mammoth fossils and specimens. We're kind of stuck like that. So just last year we took off on the research vessel Sikuliak, which is UAF's research vessel. It's ice capable. We were out there when there wasn't ice. But our goal for this project, we spent a month on this ship. It was my first time at sea. I loved it, almost all of it. But I had a really great time. We took over the entire ship for the duration of, because our operation was massive. You'll get to see a little bit of that. And we zoomed from Nome all over the Bering Land Bridge, the submerged Bering Land Bridge. And it looks a little bit like a drunken sailor, right? I mean, we're just kind of zooming about all over the place. But actually, you can see why this took us a month, because most of those transects were taken at about 5 knots, which there was a reason for it. We're gonna zoom in on this little spot right here. They got great names as well. We all took turns in naming it. It's like mashed potatoes. What else do we have there? What's your favorite?
Figgy pudding.
The figgy pudding. There's a Rhubarbie's World. These all make their way into the scientific literature, which will be fantastic when that happens. So here we are cruising along at 5 knots. And we're scanning the bottom of the seafloor using geophysical techniques. Again, this is not my field of expertise. And long hours were spent watching this happen. And it was very, very boring. It was like, this would penetrate down into the mud and would tell us not only what the surface was like, bathymetry, but also what the mud was like as well. And it was very boring until we came across things like this. Ooh, let's zoom in on that. Do you know what it is? It's a submerged lake. That used to be on the Bering Land Bridge. And you can actually see in the geophysics all these little curved layers. You can see them right there. And so our goal, when we would find one of these, there would be excitement. And somebody who was ever watching this, they'd be like half asleep, they would radio up to the captain. You had a direct line up to the captain and be like, stop the ship. And you would give the GPS coordinates at the middle of that lake that you recorded. And this ship is amazing. It's got these like Z-drive things on it that allow it to be held on station right there, and it would back the ship up right to that GPS coordinate and hold it on station. No anchors, no nothing, and it would be right there. And then our goal was to take a core right in the middle of that lake. It was like a needle in a haystack. It's incredible. These things are like maybe 1 kilometer across. This is kind of a tough thing to do. And it wouldn't have been capable without the technology of that ship. So in theory, what we should have is the top part of the core should be marine mud, right? Because that's what's being laid down right now. And hopefully what we were going to see was some freshwater lake mud beneath it. And so I have another little video for you here. It's kind of sped up a little bit because, okay. So here we are. I think I'm the one with my hands in my pockets in the back there. Like just keeping out the way. We would take turns in helping with this. It always seemed a little precarious, like sort of, there's no fence or anything. But I asked one time, what's the likelihood of survival if you dropped off the back of that thing? And one of the marine techs said to me, 50% in the daytime. I said, I fell right into the trap, like, and what about nighttime? Like pretty much zero, despite us having lights and things on us and everything like that. I also have this little, that was what's called a vibracora that we were allowing over the ship there. See if I can get this one to play as well. This is actually the big monster cora, the jumbo piston cora, and I made this little animation because we had lots of hours to do this on the ship while we were. Pow! Isn't that cool? And we're going to go in slow-mo here as well. Because you've got to watch the piston as well. See the piston in the main core there? The piston gets held in space by that line, and it stops all the mud falling right out of the core and brings it. And you get that great little trigger core as well, which is the surface sediment as well. So that was just last year, and then in November 2023, we cracked on straight away with splitting the cores because we wanted to see what we got. Because the pipes are they're not clear plastic, so we had to wait to see what we'd got. And we really hoped we'd got some mud there. And so we did 24 sites and that we'd split and described out of a total of 35 sites that we'd cored, and we sampled them for pollen, plant macrofossils, isotopes, biomarkers, diatoms, you name it, we were throwing everything at it. We took a series of cores that were specifically for ancient DNA as well, and Josh, Kira, and I spent 3 days in a Tyvek suit sampling those things. That was fun as well. We had some very good music going those days as well. But, and I'm going to zoom you in on a deep blue sea right now, once we'd split those cores. And hopefully here you can see the transition from freshwater lake mud to marine mud overlaying it. And the reason we know that that's freshwater is we start to sieve that material, and what we start to reveal are freshwater invertebrates like chironomids, plants like sedges and grasses and mosses and other freshwater plants. So these things don't grow in the ocean. They also don't survive a lot of transportation. Those chironomid head capsules, they want to split apart and bust apart. They don't survive a lot of like movement. You can't move them around by rivers or stuff like that without them getting smashed apart. These were evidence of local lake sediments there as well. And I have to show you some isotope data as well because it was really quick to generate. I was the first proxy out there. It was like, yes. And I tell you, it's smoking good. In my career, I've never seen, I always kind of like with students, I'm like, I guess we see a little bit of a trend there. So I've labeled it here for you, so you don't need to even understand isotopes at all. So blue is marine and brown is terrestrial. It's pretty intuitive, right? So there, can you see a change? Yeah, it's smoking. It's about as good and clear as I've ever seen in my years as an isotope geochemist. So we have captured and can date precisely at that location when this location submerged. But we can also do the same thing that we did on St. Paul Island. We can study all of those things like diatoms and pollen and plant macrofossils, and we can also sample those same cores for ancient DNA as well to see who was drinking at those lakes, who was visiting those lakes, what plants were surrounding those lakes, the whole wonderfulness, which is remarkable considering that it's all underwater right now. And so I got some data that I only saw 2 days ago that I want to share with you, which I think is really, really, really cool. And this came from Kira in California. And so, ta-da! Guess what we found in 2 of the locations that she has analyzed for ancient DNA. Mammoth DNA in this core, which is like makes me really, really happy, which is great. And they're from parts of the core that date to about 14 to 12. It may go back earlier, but these are just a set of 4 samples that she did tests on to get data as soon as possible. So we know that mammoths were at these sites then somewhere between 14 and 13, 12,000 years ago, like that. But of course, those sites submerged and disappeared. And obviously mammoths probably had to move, right? They probably would have moved. Well, we kind of know one place that they moved to was St. Paul Island, because it's kind of uncanny that at about the same time that mammoth DNA was kind of disappearing from those islands in the lowlands, they were showing up on St. Paul Island back then. We also know that mammoths, actually from frozen permafrost samples in northwestern Canada, mammoths were present somewhere about 9,000 years ago. This to me is remarkable as well, is that you've got really, most fossils, if you date them for mammoths from the mainland, come back 12,000 at the very youngest. So any evidence for mammoths lower than 10,000 years ago is remarkable. And so there's 9,000-year-old ancient DNA from northwest Canada. You've got 7,000-year-old from the mainland of Russia as well, from S.K. Vilisev's group. We also know that there are mammoth specimens on Wrangel Island off the northern coast of Russia as well. So you do have a number of locations where you have relatively young mammoths. But what about the mainland? And this brings me to the Adopt a Mammoth project. So the Adopt a Mammoth project was something we started about 2 years ago. It's a collaboration between the University of Alaska Museum of the North. And the goal is to radiocarbon date all of the undated mammoth remains in the collection. And there are about 1,500 of them, and only a small fraction, this pie slice, the orange pie slice, had been radiocarbon dated. Now, that's not super great for advancing science, because the first thing you need, information you need from a specimen, is the age of the specimen. And so with a lot of these specimens not even dated, you know, their full value is not being kind of realized. And so we set about trying to do this. And this is a different model. If you went to the National Science Foundation and asked for this kind of like fishing trip, hey, I want to date 1,500 mammoth, they would kind of question that. So we went with a different model. This is through crowdsourcing. And so we have this project, and people from all over the world are adopting mammoths. What that means is they're not actually getting a mammoth specimen. It means that they are linked to and associated with, for eternity, with a specific mammoth fossil from the collection. And they make a donation, and that donation actually pays for the radiocarbon date of that specimen. And it's actually a big competition as well, because for the person that finds the most recent mammoth, the youngest one in the collection, there's actually going to be a prize. There'll be a trophy. And I'm hoping it's going to be made of a piece of mammoth tusk or something like that. Kind of appropriate. So that's the competition. Actually, if you stick around for the entire talk, does everyone have a ticket? Yeah, all have tickets? Everybody has. If you don't have a ticket, you should get a ticket, because there's a door prize, and we'll be giving away 3 adoptions of 3 mammoths. And once you've adopted a mammoth, that face is a picture. Yeah, it's so excited. I hope you win. So once you're associated with that specimen, then you get to name that specimen, as long as it's an appropriate name. We've never had to nix any names, which is really good. So you get to name, and then you get all of the data that starts to emerge on that specific specimen as well. So we return the radiocarbon date to you. Every single specimen is sampled for ancient DNA and has been sent to a lab in Luke Dalen's lab, ancient DNA lab in Sweden as well. And so we'll know whether it's a male or a female. We'll know how closely related it is to every other mammoth that is in Alaska. And so far, we've proceeded with dating about a third of the collection, so we're well on the way to working towards the goal. So this map is great because it's showing us where mammoths were located. But if we use at least elephants as an analog, we know that they don't like to stay in one place, right? So these are dots on the map. But the question here is, our final kind of story, is how do mammoths move around on the landscape? If you were to de-extinct, that's one step, but then rewild mammoths, like, are they going to stick around in one location? Or are they going to move around? And if they move around, what are their movement patterns as well? And so the lucky thing about studying mammoths is that they carry these things around attached to their skulls. These things are amazing. They're like chemical GPS units being attached to a mammoth's head. And because the base of the tusk is essentially when the mammoth died. And the tip is essentially when the mammoth was born. And everything in between is the entire lifetime of that mammoth. And if you're able to read clues in that tusk, you can actually reveal a great deal about mammoths. So mammoths grow a little bit like stacking a series. I like to show this in classrooms. It's like, because you get it. It's like you take a stack of ice cream cones, you take a new ice cream cone, you stuff it in the bottom, you grow the tusk. And this is how mammoth tusks gradually grow. They're shoving a tiny layer of new tusk every day into that mammoth. And if you have a good enough microscope, you can see daily bands in those tusks. And so this is one that we split, and I've dyed it with some blue dye so you can see the pattern a little bit as well. So you can see those kind of ice cream cones stacked on top of each other. And what we do is we split a tusk, which is quite an adventure in its own right, I can tell you. It takes a very big bandsaw. And then we take samples. In fact, we take samples that we're using laser ablation on to get the sample into the mass spectrometer. Laser ablation allows us to take samples that are smaller than a hair, human hair width. Tiny, tiny little ablations. The first tusk that we did, we generated 400,000 isotopic measurements on that tusk. Once we've done that, we focus on strontium isotopes. Once we've done that, we can then compare those data from the tusk, that timeline of tusk, another wiggly line. We can compare those with a map of the strontium isotope variability across Alaska. And this is a map that was generated by one of my graduate students, Juliet Funk, and published back in 2020. And so you can see the colors change, and the colors are different isotopic values. And so we don't need to understand that. It's just that there's different colors. So we measured those. And so the question is, like, why would the strontium isotopes change in a mammoth with movement? The map is dictated by underlying geology, but mammoths don't eat rocks. So how does that work? So actually, the underlying geology has different isotopic forms, and we're going to use color to signify that. And it shapes and influences the overlying soil to shape its isotopic composition. That in turn changes and dictates the isotopic composition of the plants. So you can see where this is going, right? And so I even had a change in color. Look, there it goes. So eventually it's red. And that gets laid down and recorded in the mammoth tusk in that order. It's the modeling side of this is a little bit more complicated than that, but you get the gist. So let's think about some hypothetical movement patterns, wiggly lines, that you might expect to see. Just think, what might it look like? Well, it could look like this, right? It would be really boring. It could be flatline. If they're not moving anywhere, they're going to look something like that. It's going to be a flat, wiggly line. If you had the mammoth doing something like a seasonal migration, if I was going over to that side of the auditorium and then returning to here and out and back and out and back in a very regular, that would be what we would call a seasonal migration. Very predictable, very regular. Another model of movement for megafauna is dispersal as well. And that's a creature deciding it's going to go wherever it feels like going. And so what did we see? I got another little movie for you here. So this is when we compared the wiggly line of strontium to the isotopic map of Alaska for the first mammoth, which we named Kik. It was found above the Brooks Range. That's that white set of mountains that had more glaciation back when Kik was alive, which was 18,000 years ago. But the really cool thing is, and you see Kik changing color as well. That's the summer parts of the tusk and the winter parts of the tusk. So we can even know where he was. We know he's a he as well because we genetically sequenced the DNA preserved in the tusk as well. I'm going to advance it a little bit because he's just bouncing around on the North Slope right now. But let's go, you see the years are changing here as well. We're in year 16 right now. Oh, it's come south of the Brooks Range. Moved into Fairbanks. It's kind of moving around on campus right now. That would make a good police email, wouldn't we? Like mammoth on campus. We get them for moose occasionally, but so when we actually stretched this out to a straight line, Kik actually could have gone around the globe twice. He moved everywhere, just all over the place. But really what we're looking at is a dispersal rather than a seasonal migration. So this was really interesting because if you watch the BBC's Walking with Beasts, they have it like a seasonal migration. And it's like, well, that's not what this mammoth was doing in Alaska. One of the really cool things that we found was there were certain frequently used areas that Kik used as well. Just kept on coming back to, kept on being in the landscape. And I've color-coded those yellow and red here as the juvenile stage, the young stage, and also the adult as well. And his death location was above the Arctic Circle, above the Brooks Range here. Just this year, another graduate student of mine, Audrey Rowe, published this paper in Science Advances at the start of the year. This was a second tusk. This was from, there's a few differences about this tusk compared to Kik, and there's some similarities as well, and we'll get into those as well. So this was from a female mammoth. Again, we were able to sequence the DNA. It was actually found in interior Alaska. The big difference here is Kik was a paleontological sample, was not involved with people whatsoever. The difference here with Elma Uge was the name given to this mammoth, is actually from an archaeological context. There are actually two tusks that are from archaeological contexts in Alaska, only two. And we had just completed work on the second one as well, which was also from an archaeological site, the Holtzman site, which is only a stone's throw from where this one was found at Swan Point. The oldest confirmed, well-confirmed archaeological site in Alaska, at somewhere around 14, just greater than 14,000 years ago. And what you notice about the data underneath it, it's not a straight line, is it? It's not a straight line. And so this mammoth also moved around considerably. One of the really cool things about this female was that she actually spent her younger years across the border, in Canada, from Alaska, and then moved to spend her last 3 years in and around interior Alaska. And actually overlapped, one of the things we found very interesting was that her frequently used areas actually overlapped to some extent with those of an 18,000-year-old mammoth as well. So to my eye, I know it's an N of 2, but it starts to speak of site fidelity, perhaps, that mammoths over thousands of years may have been coming back and returning to the same locations. Probably the most interesting thing about this is this white dot. All of earliest archaeological sites are somewhere in this vicinity. And so we suggest in this paper that perhaps even this potential fidelity to this location by mammoths may even have been an attractive thing for some of the earliest people coming into Alaska, latching on to, hey, mammoths kind of show up here on a regular basis. So that's kind of a work in progress, and I'll be interested to see where the Holtzman tusk takes us as well. So all of these data are just parts of a jigsaw puzzle that continues to unfold and emerge and start to reveal some of the nuanced information about how mammoths behaved, how they lived, kind of like a natural history program kind of emerging in front of our eyes here. And I guess I hope that some of this work also, in Alaska, helps shine a light on some of the concerns that we have for other megafauna that are suffering in the face of climate change today. Well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate you coming out and